Tonight on Nation to Nation, Senator Brian Francis takes issue with funding cuts to the Residential Schools Documents Advisory Committee.
It tells me about the level of commitment from the government about true and meaningful reconciliation.
Madeleine Redfern is part of a new organization set up to assist Indigenous women who have been victims of forced sterilization.
A lot of Indigenous women over many decades who have been subjected to sterilization against their will.
The John Howard Society is using the courts to increase the rights of inmates when it comes to alleged infractions within the Saskatchewan correctional system.
I think what I hear from my clients oftentimes relating to this system is that it's not fair.
Welcome to this week's episode of Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. Brian Francis is one of the co-authors of a new Senate report that looks for answers on why residential school survivors are still unable to access thousands of documents that relate to their time spent in the system. He also recently raised the issue of government funding cuts to Residential Schools Documents Advisory Committee in the Senate. Senator Francis joins me now. Welcome to Nation Nation, Senator Francis.
Thank you for having me.
All right, as we just discussed sort of in the preamble there, can you tell me how this issue of cuts to the Residential School Documents Advisory Committee came to your attention?
Yes, I heard about it during an event with residential school survivors and leaders that this had taken place, and I heard it just before the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And my understanding is the chairperson and members have had to cease operations due to a lack of funding. I'd further maybe invite you to reach out to Cadmus Delorme of the committee, and as well Stephanie Scott of the NCTR for further information.
Okay, so it sounds like from what you're saying and what you said in the Senate, they're unable to do any work right now because they don't have any money.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly it. Yeah.
And do you know what, I mean, we covered, this was last June, I think they announced that he was formerly this is Cadmus Delorme was formerly the chair, and they announced the committee and what they'd be doing. They didn't really say much about the funding that the committee would get. Do you know what kind of dollars we're talking here? Did he bring that to your attention?
I think for that, probably it's better to touch base with them directly in terms of the actual dollar amount.
Yes,
it's significant enough that they can't continue to do their work, so that's critical.
Right, and this kind of loops back into some of your previous work. Also, of course, you did the report recently on access to missing documents. You and others in the Senate. I guess, how bad is the situation out there of getting access to these documents, and how slowly, I guess, is the government moving on it, because this is really something that's been committed to quite some time ago, yet from what we understand, there's thousands, maybe tens of thousands of documents that both survivors and the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation cannot get access to.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is, and it's very concerning, very disheartening that survivors are still waiting for answers years later after there's a commitment made to work towards, obtaining answers for them and their families. And to me, it tells me about the level of commitment from the government about true and meaningful reconciliation when all the group here is looking for, the committee and the NCTR, is proper funding to get to the truth of what really happened and get to the history, of what happened to survivors and loved ones during the residential school era.
And you raised this in the Senate, I think, last week, and of course you raised it with the government leader of the Senate, from what I understand or saw. Have you had any discussions with either Minister Andesandegri or anybody in the government about what's going on and when this funding might be restored or why it was cut?
No, I have not heard anything in response to the question I asked, other than at that time the government leader, Mark Gold, committed to looking into it with me, but I haven't heard anything from his office or Minister Andesandegri's office or so on.
Okay, and you mentioned it a little bit briefly, but this wasn't something that was announced in the budget, or you're finding about through other channels, or having a meeting with survivors before or on National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, and also similar to sort of what happened with some of the changes to funding and reduced funding for searches for unmarked graves that we've covered quite extensively in the past few weeks. You kind of mentioned it briefly, but Is the government not really being transparent about this issue for, which is quite key, obviously, to residential school survivors?
Well, my opinion is they're not being very transparent because these types of things seem to get communicated at various different times, and it's not really clear what the message is or why the cuts are taking place. So I think there needs to be more transparency here. And in addition to that, more than the transparency is a commitment to actually do the work. Because reconciliation, in my opinion, is about actions. Words matter at the start, but then what actions are going to be taking place to continue with true and meaningful reconciliation.
And I imagine as part of your work, you obviously were just talking to survivors recently, and also as part of this work that you were, had witnesses coming into committee, and that I imagine there's a fair amount of disappointment, I suppose, from survivors that it seems like maybe the government at the present time isn't moving forward, but maybe a little bit backwards on this issue.
Yes, that would be how I would see it as well. I talked to survivors at various times, and that they're moving on in years. They're frustrated, extremely, very much so, at the lack of work that's being progressing in terms of the documentation and getting the true documents so that they can find out what happened to their loved ones. So, yeah, I think it's very frustrating and it's disheartening. My opinion is it's just not right. I mean, this should be a no-brainer to move forward on this type of stuff so that the answers can be given to the people that want to know what happened to their loved ones.
Now, the government has always brought up in the past that that it's not as simple as this. There's third-party agreements. There's privacy. That it's not as easy as maybe might seem of just getting these documents. Is that, in your opinion, a valid argument, or has that sort of just been something to maybe stall the process?
Yeah, in my opinion, that's not a valid argument at all. What is simple is providing adequate funding to those organizations so that they continue to do the work that will bring answers to survivors and their loved ones.
And maybe just to tail onto that question as well is, I think maybe our viewers don't know this necessarily, but these documents are spread out over a lot of different places from what I understand. Some of them are in community halls. A lot of them are, of course, in churches. Some are at the Vatican. Some are with the government. They're really all over the place from what I understand.
Yes, absolutely. They cross various jurisdictions, and as you mentioned, even in the Vatican. So it's a very complicated process to have these records all brought into one area, brought home. So there needs to be special resources allocated to that to do the job properly, so that there's no gap in the history of the true history of the residential schools.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there for time reasons, but once again, thanks for joining us, and thanks for drawing this important issue to our attention.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you having me on this issue because it's certainly important to get the message out there.
Up next, we'll talk to Madeleine Redfern about the newly formed Survivors Circle for Reproductive Justice. Welcome back. Indigenous women have long been victims of forced or coerced sterilization. A new nonprofit organization has been formed to assist survivors. It's called the Survivors Circle for Reproductive Justice. The organization aims to set up a national registry for survivors, provide healing support funds, data, research, and public education. Joining me today to talk about the Survivors Circle for Reproductive Justice is one of its board members, Madeleine Redfern. Okay, well, thanks for joining us, and welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you.
Can you first maybe tell our viewers how the Survivors Circle for Reproductive Justice, I guess, came into existence? It's a fairly recent thing.
So we are familiar with the work that Senator Yvonne Boyer has been doing for years to raise the awareness of this issue. And she contacted quite a number of us to see about the creation of a national organization to be able to provide support to survivors and to also facilitate the engagement with the Government of Canada as a vehicle to be able to provide funding to survivors for their healing purposes.
Okay, and then maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of the things that the organization will do.
So the primary purpose is to support the survivors of those who've been forced or coerced into sterilization. We know that there have been a lot of Indigenous women over many decades who have been subjected to sterilization against their will or without full knowledge or consent. And of course, that not only has a tremendous impact on the individual, but of course, their family and the communities at large. So the primary goal is to provide the survivors the opportunity to get healing in the manner and that they see is necessary for their healing path, as well as for their family.
And I understand one of the things that we'll do, or that you want to do, is a registry. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, one of the important things in being able to provide support to survivors is effectively having a registration system, allowing women to come forward and identify that they believe that they were sterilized or suspect they were sterilized, or a family member, a loved one was. And then that allows us to reach out to them so that they are aware of the various financial supports or other supports that our organization can provide. We recently supported a gathering of survivors who recognize that there is value in coming together, that they're not alone. It didn't just happen to them. And to be able to provide the healing, the sharing the stories, the impacts, and that there are women who have a wide range of different experiences or are also on a different path in their healing journey. And so that there are women who can see, women who have come through and are feeling, this happened to me, and maybe aren't as angry or as resentful and as, that intense feeling. And that really being able to relate to someone who has gone through this experience is incredibly important.
Okay, I thought I might ask you also about the broader public awareness, because I know that even when we covered sort of Senator Boy on her bill, and she worked in healthcare, that she was quite appalled to realize how prevalent forced and coerced sterilizations are even currently, and how far-reaching it is for Indigenous women. Do you think the public in general is more aware of this issue, or is that one of the things that your organization will be trying to do?
I think there's some that are starting to become aware of this issue. And for those, even some of that awareness, they think it's historical, like the residential schools. The fact is that forced sterilization of Indigenous women even happened last year. And so people are shocked to learn that this is still a potential risk for our women. And that as I said, it's not just an impact on the individual. It's a huge impact on the relationship with their spouses, with their children, their siblings, their mothers, their grandmothers. It effectively prevents and stops a woman from being able to make informed decisions about whether or not she wants to expand her family or not. It stops effectively, siblings from having other siblings, uncles from having their nephews or nieces. The impact is huge. And unfortunately, systemic discrimination plays a huge role in that.
Now, of course, we covered Senator Boy's bill in the Senate and in committee, and I'm sure you've been watching it closely as well. Now, one of the things that came up is that already, if a doctor or physician does something against patient's consent, that's viewed as assault, so that it is already in the criminal code. Yet Senator Boy and others want to strengthen the language to be more specific. Can you maybe tell me why that's a bit important to have to criminalize this actual behavior in the criminal code?
Well, in part because there has been no pressing of charges of any medical professional that has done this, and potentially up to 12 or 15,000 Indigenous women over the decades. Not a single one. So by strengthening the language through Bill S250, there is a specific language that targets the criminalization of sterilizing any woman, an Indigenous woman, against their expressed consent. And so, the goal is for the medical professional, professionals and the profession as a whole to realize that they must provide Indigenous women more information when and if there is ever deemed a medical procedure that might require sterilization, so that the woman fully understands what her rights are and makes an informed decision on whether or not she wishes to proceed. But more often than not, there's virtually little to no conversation that even happens. I know from the work that I did with the Kikitani Truth Commission, we were shocked to learn how often, because of the cultural and language and regional, barriers or differences, is that more often than not, medical professionals decided to make the unilateral decision on what they thought was best for a particular individual, and especially Indigenous women.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave it there for time purposes, but thanks once again very much for joining us today and bringing our attention to this very important issue.
Thank you.
After the break, we'll talk to John Howard Society lawyer Pierre Hawkins about a case taking place in the Supreme Court of Canada this week that seeks to increase the burden of proof necessary for alleged infractions within the Saskatchewan correctional system. Welcome back. The John Howard Society of Saskatchewan is facing off against the Saskatchewan government in the Supreme Court of Canada this week. At issue is the burden of proof correctional officials must show before penalizing inmates for alleged infractions. Saskatchewan correctional facilities currently use a balance of probability standards. The John Howard Society would like to set this or see this increase to a beyond a reasonable doubt threshold, similar to what a defendant would receive in any sort of criminal trial. Joining me today in studio today to talk about this is John Howard Society lawyer Pierre Hawkins. Welcome to Nation, Mr. Hawkins.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so I thought I would start off that maybe you could explain for our viewers, because it's a little technical, what exactly is the difference between balance of probabilities and then beyond a reasonable doubt?
Yeah, so this case is really about making sure that when inmates are accused of breaking prison rules, that they actually did it. A balance of probabilities really says that it's more likely than not that they did it, or they probably did it. But the beyond a reasonable doubt standard ensures that there's enough evidence to say with some degree of certainty that the person actually did the thing they're accused of doing. It's important because in this system, the penalties are really harsh. People can be subject to solitary confinement. They can have their release date pushed back through a loss of earned remission. So it's really important that we make sure that that when people are sentenced to those sanctions, that they actually did what they're accused of doing.
Okay, and then what would this actually mean for, I guess, inmates in the Saskatchewan system?
I think what I hear from my clients oftentimes relating to this system is that it's not fair. And they say it's not fair for two reasons. First, because very little evidence is brought against them to prove that they actually did it. And second, because the matter is actually heard by a panel of correctional staff and managers. And it's not to say that those people are always biased against the inmates. It's just to say that when those decision makers have to decide whether to believe, say, their staff or the inmate who's accused of doing something wrong, that they're inclined to believe their colleague, their subordinate, and there are many reasons why they should favor that testimony. So what we're really trying to do here is bring some fairness to the whole thing, and to try to give inmates a sense that they have a fair shake if they're accused of something that someone around them has done but they weren't involved with, or that they have no idea about.
Now, of course, they're already in a prison system, and the penalties, of course, are even more severe. Being in prison in general isn't nice. What sort of, this could lead to somebody being in segregation or pretty harsh circumstances that may not be guilty of the infraction, from what I understand?
I think that's exactly right, and I think with the harms that we know that segregation causes to the individual, to their mental health, particularly if they have some kind of pre-existing mental health issue, or frankly, many people in all prison systems, but especially in Saskatchewan's prison system, have a lot of trauma in their, are dealing with a lot of issues relating to trauma. And we know that solitary confinement, the segregation, can make those issues worse. And so we think it's very, very important that there be strict protections around the use of that sanction.
Now, of course, you're in the Supreme Court of Canada this week arguing this case. What are some of the arguments that Saskatchewan's making as to why they cannot or will not adopt this higher standard?
So Saskatchewan takes a position that this isn't a criminal proceeding and that effectively they can only be required to meet the higher beyond a reasonable doubt standard in proceedings that are criminal. We say, of course, that requirements are broader than that any time that the state wants to accuse someone of doing something wrong, try to prove that they've done something wrong and then punish them for it with a loss of liberty, that they need to meet that higher standard. That's what this really comes down to.
And to meet that higher standard, because I understand Correctional Services Canada does have it, what would the Saskatchewan correctional system have to do? What resources would they have to add?
Well, I think it's important to note that correctional systems, that jails, are some of the most strictly surveilled areas in our society. There are cameras just about everywhere aside from inside of inmates' cells. There's strict monitoring of what inmates do, and there are tremendous search powers available under the legislation. And so the beyond a reasonable doubt standard isn't really about a sort of quantity of evidence. It's not that they would have to go and collect a massive amount of evidence to prove that someone did something wrong. It's about the quality of that evidence. It's about, showing video that they did something wrong, or about having statements from reliable witnesses to say that they did something wrong.
Of course, we've covered a lot of stories about the outrageously high numbers of Indigenous people in jails, both at Corrections Canada and in the provinces as well, and that often their rights are not very well served. But for the larger public, is it a hard argument to make? Because I think a lot of people sort of think, okay, you're guilty of a crime, you're in jail. That's just the way it is, right? Why is this so important that we uphold these rights, I suppose, or the way the John Howard Society sees in the prison system that are accorded to other individuals?
So I think it's important to remember that if you have a system which punishes people who haven't done anything wrong, and the people in that system know that, and don't have much respect for that system, as a result, you're not going to get the kind of order in prisons that you're looking for by using the lower standard. So it's a bit self-defeating. We want people to understand that they have a fair shake and to only be punished if they did something wrong. I think that only bolsters the credibility of that system in the eyes of inmates and order in prisons generally. You also raised, of course, the massive over-incarceration of Indigenous people, and that's especially prominent in Saskatchewan. In Saskatchewan correctional facilities, over 75% of people at any given time are Indigenous. And I think it's important that we remember that when a system so disproportionately impacts a population that's so disproportionately Indigenous, we have to make sure that that system is fair. And there are all sorts of reasons, institutional, historical, why the governments involved need to make sure that it's fair.
Okay, well, we're going to have to end it there for time purposes, but thanks once again very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.